In this extended video, targeting primarily X-Plane power users, we are going to learn the basics of the FlyWithLua plugin, as well as how to use that to enable more advanced controller profile mapping. Let's go ahead and begin. Hey everybody, how are you doing today? My name is Thomas Neild. I am very excited to show you today how to use multi-function buttons in any controller. I am the engineering lead for Yaman Aero. We manufactured this handheld flight simulation controller, and we're going to use it as the vehicle to demonstrate how to enable multi-function button presses. And by multifunction, what I mean by that is you can actually hold down button combinations. By default, X-Plane will limit you to only tie one function to every single button, and you can't hold down combinations of buttons to perform different functions. There is a way to enable that though. What you can do is you can use a scripting language called FlyWithLua, and that engine is going to allow you to create very powerful, even context-driven functionalities for your buttons, and we will get into all of that. For now, let me just show the status quo, what you get with X-Plane by default. So I have the Yaman Aero plugged into X-Plane. Of course, what I'm about to show you can apply to other controllers and other HOTAS and yokes and panels. If you are plugging in multiple devices, the information is going to change a little bit. But for what I'm about to show you, this will work with just one controller. And maybe down the road, we'll talk about how to manage multiple controllers later with FlyWithLua. I'm going to go to the controller screen. So if you're in X-Plane, if you start a flight, you can also access this from the settings in the main menu. But I'm going to open up in this top left corner this little slider icon. And you'll see here that I have a default loaded for Yaman Aero. So the idea is that, my pitch and roll on the thumbstick, I have my sliders, and the buttons are tied to different default functions as well, and the POV. Now this is all great, and this is going to give a lot of basic users what they need. However, if you're going to start running out of buttons and controls to do more advanced tasks like autopilot, for example, or maybe some more elaborate camera movements that you want to perform. And so I'm going to show you how to enable all of that. And so, like I said, this is all great. All of this is typically implemented in the Joy profile in the X-Plane installation folder. But I want to show you how to use FlyWithLua. So I'm going to exit out of here. I am going to switch over to another screen to my left where I have the FlyWithLua page opened. Now you'll find it at xplane.org. I will provide a link in the description. And you'll have to create an account, otherwise you're not going to see this download this file button. So make sure you create your account with xplane.org, go to this link, and then you'll be able to download the plugin for X-Plane for FlyWithLua. So there's a lot of good information right here, and I definitely recommend reading it, although hopefully this tutorial that I'm about to show you will teach the FlyWithLua basics, particularly with a bias on how to map a controller. And there's also this nice first steps using FlyWithLua that has some helpful information as well, including on controller mapping. But let's see if we can encapsulate a lot of this information so you can get up and running very quickly with the Yaman Aero, as well as any joystick, HOTAS, or yoke that you have in your arsenal. So I am going to download this file, and as soon as it finishes downloading, so I've actually downloaded this before, so that's why it's called FlyWithLua 2. So inside the FlyWithLua folder, you'll see that we have all of these folders and files. This is the entirety of the FlyWithLua plugin. So what you need to do, let me go to my downloads folder to show this here. So the FlyWithLua folder that we just downloaded you need to copy this. And so whether you're on Windows, Mac, or Linux, you're going to copy it to the Xplain12 folder inside a specific directory. So if you're using Mac OS, which is what I'm using right now, I'm running Xplain on my little MacBook Air M2, and it's been performing pretty nicely. It's going to store in the user folder. So typically if I right-click on this this header up here, you'll see your user account with a folder name, and that is going to be your user folder. So if I go there, if you're using, and you'll see Xplain12 has a folder in that account. If you're on Windows, you're going to typically find it in something similar. It used to be program files, but more nowadays, you're going to find it in the user folder as well, where you'll find Xplain. And if you ever get lost in Windows trying to figure out where it's located, you can actually just right-click on the Xplain launcher and go to its properties, and you'll see typically where it's installed. So the instructions are going to be the same for Windows or Mac from that point forward after you find the Xplain folder. So in Xplain12, I'm going to open up the Xplain12 folder. I am going to go to Resources, and then I'm going to go into Plugins, and then I am going to paste FlyWithLua into this directory. Now you can see I've already done that, so we are good to go. So you're going to paste it here, and now you have FlyWithLua installed. Now when you start up Xplain next time, if you already have it running, go ahead and restart Xplain again. What you'll notice is that if you go into the menu up here, you'll see that there is this new drop-down item called FlyWithLua. And there's a couple of really interesting commands here. The one I want to point out is reload all Lua script files. And there's also this menu FlyWithLua macros. So we'll talk about both of these. So reload all Lua script files. What that means is that any script files that are inside the scripts folder in that plugin folder are going to be reloaded. So let's actually go back to my FlyWithLua directory. You know what? I'm going to minimize and declutter my desktop a bit here. 1 second. There we go. Okay, so in my plugins folder, what you're going to see is the FlyWithLua. Open that, and you're going to see 3 different folders that are notable here. You're going to have the scripts folder, which right now is empty, but any scripts that you want Xplain to run when it first launches are going to go in here. Also, if there are any default scripts in here, go ahead and delete them. I believe one of them is called the stupid bubble test. You can just go ahead and delete that script because we don't need it. You can also hit that reload all scripts command like I showed you earlier back under the plugins menu. So go to plugins, FlyWithLua, and reload all Lua script files. That will execute all the scripts in that file again. And there's also the scripts disabled folder. So this is an archive of scripts that are examples. And they're not active right now, but you can actually go through these and try them out to try different tasks. We're actually going to use 1 or 2 of them later. So like for example, there's a script to get access assignments, and there's other scripts to build different dashboards to mess with different settings, as well as a pedal visualizer. But I want to focus on controllers primarily and how to do multifunction buttons in a controller. There's also this quarantine folder, so if any of those scripts have any errors or something goes wrong, Xplain is going to give a very, very auditory alert. It's literally going to have a female robot voice saying the scripts have been quarantined. You'll see what I mean in a moment when we get to that. But let's go ahead and start our first script. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to open up just any plain note editor. So you can use Notepad, you can use Visual Studio Code, which I'll show a workflow at the very, very end of this. But you can just use any standard text editor and open it up. Right here, I'm going to be using Cot Editor on my Mac. And what I am going to do is I am going to write my first Lua script. So it's blank right now, and the file is untitled. So I'm going to hit File, Save, and I am going to save this file in that FlyWithLua scripts folder. So I'm going to go inside the Xplane folder, and I'm going to go to Resources, go to Plugins, FlyWithLua, and I'm going to go in the scripts folder, and I'm going to call this my script.lua. So it's very important to put the .lua extension on here, so it's not recognized as just a plain text file, but rather it is a Lua script file. Now, we're going to write some Lua code. Now, if you've not done any coding before, try not to be intimidated here. I'm going to just show you a few patterns that will help you get by in mapping a controller. And once you learn these patterns that you can copy and paste and adapt, you should be well underway to become productive. So let's first start off by calling a function called clear all button assignments. So later I'm just going to start copying and pasting code, but I'll start typing a little bit to get us started. So this function, when this script is first picked up by Xplane as it launches, the first thing it's going to do is it's going to clear all the button assignments. So all of the buttons on this controller are going to have their assignments cleared. They're going to be blank. And you will literally see, as a matter of fact, let's just look at that right now. So I'm going to save this file. I'm going to go over back to Xplane. I'm going to go to Plugins, FlyWithLua, and I'm going to hit Reload All Lua Script Files. So it's going to check that folder, that scripts folder, and launch all the scripts it finds in it. Now, you'll notice that when I go into the control panel, notice how all of the buttons no longer have assignments. They're all labeled Do Nothing, including the hat switch, which is also considered a button. We left the axes alone. There is a command to clear the axes, but we'll talk about that later. I want to put a lot of focus on the buttons first because that's what we're mostly going to be doing combinations of, and we're interested in multifunctioning. So you could theoretically do multifunctions with axes too, but that becomes pretty fringe, and that's not something we will focus on in this video. But notice here, all of the buttons have been cleared. They do not have assignments. And we're going to have Lua take over assigning those buttons afterwards. So there is a function called set button assignment. Let me just copy and paste that command right here. And this is going to, so first it's going to clear all button assignments, and the next line of code it executes, because that's how code typically is executed. It's executed from top to bottom. It's going to go through every single line in this file and execute each one at a time. And the way FlyWithLua works by default is it's going to run this file just once, execute all the commands in it, and then it's done, unless you reload all of the Lua scripts again. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to set the button assignment. I'm going to set button 6, and I'm going to tie it to this function, sim general hat switch left. Now you might be wondering where did this 6 come from and where did this command come from? So there's two components to that. Let's first discuss this one. This is the action we want to perform in the sim. All right, so I am going to go back to the menu in Xplane, and let me show you something. I'm going to go to Settings, and you'll notice that, well, one, I'm going to actually reset my defaults. So here's the thing. If you feel like you've messed up and you're like, oh shoot, I want all the defaults back, you can simply do that by hitting reset to defaults for that given controller by hitting this button down here. And I'll hit reset joystick configuration. Now, it is going to annoy me about calibration, and I'm not going to really worry about that right now. Actually, you know what? It's going to force me to, so let me just go ahead and do that real quick. So I'm just going to satisfy it, give it all the axes, make sure it has all the movement. There we go. So I got full range. Now it's going to want me to allow the controls to center. All right, okay, so we appeased it, ran a calibration, so that is one annoyance when you reset back to the defaults. So putting all of those functions back, something that is enormously useful is if I go into each of these functions for the buttons, if I hit edit, for example, you'll see obviously we have a huge list of commands we can choose from, and we can search those commands. But this is the cool part, is notice here when I hover over that specific command, we see a very important piece of information. So for example, this autopilot switch toggle. So the command is sim autopilot or sim/autopilot/electric /electric master toggle. These are the commands you will need to programmatically in Lua assign buttons to. And so if I were to go back to a different command, so let's see here. So if I wanted to see what's the command for, toggle, pitch trim up or pitch trim down. So if I hit edit and I hover over that, you'll see that the command is sim/flight control/pitch trim up. So that's the programmatic call version of that command. These are what we call DataRefs in X-Plane. And these DataRefs, these little commands in this, in this slash form, in this organized form, where it's like sim/flight control/pitch trim up. These are what you're going to call in the Lua environment. So this is a really helpful, subtle feature in X-Plane. Is if you're a developer, which is kind of what you're doing right now, is you can actually hover over each of these and see what that command is. So I'm going to hit done. There is one other thing that we do have to answer the question to. So we understand this part, this second argument. So when we call set button assignment, we say the button number that we're assigning this action to, and here's the action, which corresponds to those actions we saw hovering over each action in the settings. But where does the button 6 come from? So this is a little less intuitive, and there are ways to surface what each of these buttons are. The easiest way is to use an internal script that FlyWithLua has, where every button you press, it will show that button number on the screen. All right, so there's a really helpful internal script that we're going to copy and paste from. This script will also be on the link containing all the code I'm showing you right now, but it's called Button Sniffer. So I'm going to open up the FlyWithLua folder again, and I do recommend you pin the X-Plane 12 folder and even the FlyWithLua folder inside to your Explorer so that you can access it easily, like I'm doing right now. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go into the internals folder. This is not something you're going to go into very often, but there's a couple of helpful scripts in here. This button sniffer script is very, very helpful. So I'm going to copy this, and I'm going to copy that into the scripts folder and put it alongside my own script. So I'm going to go to paste item, and I'm going to launch this button sniffer. Now you could open this up if you're curious just to see what it is and what's inside. I'm not going to go through it because the focus is mostly going to be on controllers, but we are going to use it for the purposes of identifying each button. So I'm going to resume my last flight, and we're going to reload that last Lua script. Okay, so now that I'm going to go to Plugins, FlyWithLua, and I'm going to hit Reload All Lua Scripts. And of course, it's going to clear out my controller and remove all those buttons again, like we did, like we specified earlier. But I want to show that inside the FlyWithLua menu, there's this other menu item called Macros, where we get to choose when to launch a script rather than have that script eagerly launched when X-Plane launches. And you'll see there's this new menu item called Show Joystick Button Numbers. And I'll show you how to create your own macros later so you can choose when to launch the script based on selecting it from this menu. But we're going to use the Button Sniffer's Show Joystick Button Numbers function. So when I click that, notice that in the top left corner it's saying no button pressed. But if I hold down each of these buttons, it's going to give me the button number. So this top left button on the 6-pack, that's button 9. And it said it was pressed, and now it was released. Then it's button 10, button 11, button 12, 13, 14. The bumpers are going to be 18 and 16 respectively. When I click the joystick down, because the joystick actually has a click down acting as a button, that is button 8. And then we got the D-pad, so the up is 21, the right is 24, the left is 22, the down is 23, and the center is 17. So as you can probably imagine, we need to write down these button numbers. Now, if you're using the Yaman arrow, I'm going to provide those for you already. But if you're using your own controller, you can use this as a way of discovering what each of the button numbers are assigned in X-Plane. Because X-Plane may arbitrarily seem like it reassigns button numbers no matter how the HID has been programmed on this thing. And you'll see the trim wheel is button 20 and button 19 respectively for the down and up respectively. And then the POV, the hat switch, you'll see here that, and as you can see, the POV has been assigned because we put that in our script, so it's moving it to the left as we specified. So you'll see the left is 2, the right is 2, the left is 6, up is 0, and down is 4. And if I click down center on the D-pad, it's button 15. There we go. So you need to write down all of those button combinations. And then I'll show you how to do variables in a moment. But for now, write down those button numbers, and then you can start using them in the code. So let's go back to our code. And you'll see that we already assigned button 6, and that was the POV left, and we assigned it to that hat switch left function. And by the way, this dash dash followed by some text, this is a comment, meaning that it's going to not be part of the code, but it allows me to leave a little helpful comment, a little bit piece of text that I can write to basically say what this line does. So I'm saying this is doing POV left. And of course, I can write whole sentences if I want and write anything here. And this is a helpful way to document your code even for yourself, so you can basically understand what your code's doing and leave documentation for yourself. I am going to copy over some remaining basic assignments. And I will show you what those look like. Okay, so you'll see I start with that clear all button assignments like I showed you earlier, and then assigning the POV left, which is button 6. And I'm going to assign the hat switch to to do hat switch functions, move your head left, right, up, and down. I'm going to set the D-pad up, which is this up arrow right here, to zoom in. I'm going to set the D-pad down to zoom out. I'm going to set the trim wheel, obviously, to do trim. Makes sense in a Cessna, although I could probably use the POV for trim, which I'll show an example of as well. But I can use this to map trim down and trim up using buttons 19 and 20 respectively. And then D-pad left and right, those are going to move the heading bug in my heading indicator for my autopilot. So let me save this script, and let me go back to FlyWithLua, and I'm going to reload all the scripts. And now notice how my POV switch is now doing POV, doing POV left, right, up, and down respectively. So we programmatically assigned those functions to the POV. And when I hit D-pad up, so I hit this up arrow, it's going to zoom in. And when I hit down, it's going to zoom out. And again, I got all of those action commands by hovering over the actions in the menu. And notice here, so I'm going to zoom in for a moment. Let me show you this. So if I zoom in on my heading indicator, watch this. When I press the left D-pad, it's moving that bug around. When I move it right, it's moving it the other direction in the counterclockwise. So everything is working, and we created a really basic script to assign the POV and the hat the POV and the D-pad, as well as the trim wheel. Oh, I didn't show you the trim wheel. So if I zoom in on the trim wheel, you'll see that, you know, when I move the trim wheel down, it moves inside the Cessna as well. When I move it up, it's going to move it up as well. All right, so let's go back to our script. So that's how we've not really done anything too special yet. These are all things that you can do in the menu, in the controller configuration menu in X-Plane, but I'm going to show you some much more powerful things to do in a moment. But first up, we got to get a little bit more organized here. So going back to my code, we're trying to remember all of these numbers and what they do. That's kind of a pain. You know, and I could write some comments, you know, saying which buttons, you know, which buttons are which numbers, and that would help. But what would be even better, though, what would actually help a lot more is to actually save these numbers to named variables. And let me just copy and paste that code next. And again, all of these code examples are available in the link. So I'm going to take all this and I'm going to replace it with this. So it's going to have the clear all button assignments just like we did earlier. And then, but notice here, before I go into the set button assignments, I declare all of these variables. So again, a luau script is going to execute from top to bottom. It's going to execute one line at a time. And what it's doing on these lines is it's actually giving each of these numbers a name and giving it to a and giving it a label, which is a variable. So the POV up, whenever we call POV up anywhere in our code after it's been declared, this is effectively going to be a 0. It's going to replace the POV up with a 0 because that's the value of POV up. And so I have mapped all of my button numbers and given them a meaningful name that's much easier to keep track of. So I got the POV, the 6-pack, which is the 6-pack right here on the Yaman controller. You know, I got the left bumper and the right bumper and the D-pad center, wheel up, wheel down. So I've given all of the controls in my controller meaningful names. And this is going to be much easier when I set the button assignments. So you'll see here, I call, instead of calling cryptically, you know, button 6, I can call it POV left and say, oh, it's mapped to the hat switch left function. POV right, oh, it's mapped to the hat switch right. You know, D-pad up is mapped to zoom in, D-pad down is mapped to zoom out. So this makes the code a bit more organized, a bit more legible, and help make more sense. And just keep in mind it's executing these lines from top to bottom. And after you've declared these variables above, you can now use them below down here, and it will replace those given variables with their corresponding value. So I'm going to save this. I'm going to save this script, and I'm going to go back, go to plugins, FlyWithLua, reload all scripts, and you're not going to notice any difference here. It's going to still behave exactly the same from what we did before, but our code's more organized, and it's much easier to keep track of and maintain because we gave all of those button assignments names, and we kept those button numbers contained inside variables that we can refer to down here. All right, so moving on. What we're going to do next is we're going to now learn how to assign a macro. So like I said earlier, when X-Plane launches, it's going to, and you have the FlyWithLua plugin installed, it's going to launch everything inside the scripts folder. And so far we have the myscript.lua file, and we also have the button sniffer, which we'll keep it here because this is a helpful tool, although we really don't need it anymore at this point because we've already sniffed out all the buttons and found their corresponding numbers. So X-Plane is going to load these scripts and launch them. But remember, the button sniffer did not execute the button sniffing operation on launch. It actually did it when we selected it from that menu. So let me actually just give a brief reminder. So if I go to Plugins, FlyWithLua, and I do FlyWithLua macros, the show joystick button numbers, that is a macro and allows me to at any point choose when to execute a command rather than just launching it with Xplane when it first launches. And so we're going to actually package this up into our own macro as well. Let me show you how to do that. So I'm going to take this clear all button assignments, and I'm going to cut it out for a moment. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to keep my button declarations and keeping track of their numbers as is, but these set button assignments, I am going to package this up in what we call a function. And I'm going to call this function assigned buttons. And I'm going to take all of these items, and just for legibility, I'm going to tab each one over to the right. And at the very end of this, I'm going to call the end keyword. So what exactly does this do? So when I create a function for our purposes, it's not, when it gets to this part of the file, it's not going to actually call these set button assignments inside. It's going to just declare a function that would do that. But we can call this function at any point we want. So if down here, if down at the bottom of the file, I were to call assign buttons like this, then it would actually execute each of these set assignments. But what I want to do is I want to do something a bit more nuanced here. Oh, and let me put the clear button all button assignments inside of it as well. There we go. So rather than actually call assign buttons, at the very, very end, and then it finally executes this function that we declared, think of a function as reusable code. I can actually reuse this code over and over again and call it multiple times if I want to, just by calling assign buttons at any point. But what we're going to do is we're going to do something a bit more useful for our purposes in Xplane. Instead of calling the assign buttons function directly, we're going to call something called add macro. And inside parentheses, I'm going to give it the name of the macro, how I want it to appear in that drop-down menu, and I'm going to call it assign Yaman buttons. So that's how it's going to show up in the menu. And then the second argument is going to be inside double quotes, very important. And of course, this is going to be in double quotes because we have to treat this as a string, as text. And we're going to do the same thing with the function assign button. We're going to pass it inside double quotes. And what this tells Xplane to do is, hey, take this function and put it in and allow it to be callable from inside the menu item assign Yaman buttons. So when we click this menu item assign Yaman buttons, it is going to call the assign buttons function, and we can click this as many times as we need to, and it's going to rerun these lines of code inside this function. So let me show you. So first off, I'm going to go into Plugins, FlyWithLua, reload all script files. Now notice here, if I go into macros, there is that new menu entry item assign Yaman buttons. So when I click that, it is going to run all of the assignments. Now you'll notice here that it did say Lua stopped right here in the corner, so something went wrong. So I'm going to switch over back here and see what exactly happened. Now if I go to, so it says, what's that say? It says global assign button, attempt to call global assign button. Oh, so that's the problem. So you'll see it gave me it's giving me some vague errors. And the reason why it didn't work is because I called assign buttons, not assign buttons. So because that function now matches, because there was no function called assign button, it's assign buttons, then that's going to fix the issue. So I'm going to reload the scripts again, and this should cause the error to go away. So I'm going to go to Plugin, FlyWithLua, FlyWithLua macros. I'm going to call assign Yaman buttons. All right, no issues this time. And so now you got your first taste of how one-way errors can happen in Lua. Sometimes the errors are a little subtle. Sometimes Lua will scream at you and just throw your script in the quarantine folder, as I mentioned earlier. And we'll walk through an example of that shortly. So if I go inside, so you'll see that we did assign those controls as we scripted. And let's just do a little test here just to demonstrate something. So I'm going to actually take this and I am going to just, assign it to something else. Let's say assign contact ATC. So button 19, contact ATC, that's actually the trim wheel. So I changed that, but if I call that macro, assign Yaman buttons again, it's going to actually restore it back to pitch trim up and pitch trim down. So it got rid of that and assigned it back to the script. So this is actually really helpful with the macros, is that if you need to switch over to, for example, if you want to switch to a different set of controls for a different type of plane, although there's ways to dynamically do that we'll talk about briefly. This is a really helpful way of being able to pick and choose what script to run and arbitrarily when, based on your input. So while we're talking about errors, so that error that we had earlier was pretty subtle. It just showed some messages and it complained, and the reason was because we did not name that function correctly. So let's see what happens when we do a much more blatant error. So for example, I've done some Python programming before, and I actually did make this mistake yesterday when I was using FlyWithLua. Is I actually kind of went into Python mode in my mind, and rather than call function to declare a function in Lua, I actually used Python's def keyword. Now, Lua's probably not going to like this very much, and I will show just that. So watch closely. So when I call plugins FlyWithLua, reload all Lua scripts, watch what happens.
Found bad Lua scripts that have been quarantined. Look in Log.txt file for more information.
So you heard that? So it got really mad at me because there was a blatant error, a syntax error, not just a reference error. And what you'll find is that if I go inside,
check your quarantine scripts folder,
which is exactly what I'm doing right now. So it's telling me to go and check my quarantine scripts folder. So I'm going to go to resources, plugins, FlyWithLua, and you'll see that there is this quarantine folder, and you'll see, sure enough, it moved my script over here. Now, if you want to actually get some help in figuring out what your error is, and you're studying your code, it's like, I don't know what's going on, you can open up the log.txt file that exists in the xplain 12 folder, and this might give you some clues over to what happened. If you scroll to the bottom, it's going to log a bunch of other things that xplain's doing, but if you look for the FlyWithLua lines, it will share any errors it may find. And sometimes the errors can be helpful, sometimes they're not so helpful. So feel free to use the log and try to do it quickly so that you actually get to the most recent events are at the bottom, and then you can figure out what exactly went wrong with your file. Now, I know for a fact though what the problem is here. The problem is that this needs to be a function keyword. And again, I made this error because I know too many programming languages apparently, and I start to confuse them. And so I changed it to the proper keyword, which is function, not def. All right, so next up, let's do something interesting. I am going to introduce something that starts to show where the power of FlyWithLua comes in, specifically for flight sim controls. So I just pasted a new piece of code down here at the bottom of my assign buttons function. And I'm going to have to make a few changes here as well. But let me walk through what I just did here. So I have my button assignments just like I did earlier. But now I am going to change this button, 6pack 4, this button right here. I am going to set it to where if I am in the external view, so if my view is external to the airplane, then I am going to set it to perform the default view action and switch over to the default view. But if it's not the external view, it's going to switch over to the chase view. And so the default view is what you get inside the cockpit, and the chase view is outside the plane. So by pressing this button, it's going to alternate essentially between the cockpit view, the default view, and the chase view right outside the plane. And I have to use this variable is external. And if it's 1, then that means we are external. If it's 0, that means it's not external. And I have to use this DataRef function to extract it. I'm going to give the variable the name is external. And I'm going to use this DataRef right here, sim/graphics/view is external. And I'm going to tell it, hey, I'm only doing read only to this. I'm not going to make a change to this variable. I'm only going to read it. I'm not going to write to it. And this will then allow me to access the is external variable. And let me show what this does first. So I'm going to save this script. And I am going to, oh wait, there's actually one more thing I need to do. Now, because I need this to be checking this variable constantly and make updates to the button assignment based on whether we're an external view or not, I'm not going to make this a macro anymore. And you know what? I can't even just make this a plain, set of assignments. I need this function to run constantly. And I'm going to make one change here though. So I'm going to, first off, I'm going to get rid of this add macro command. And I'm going to call a different operation called do every frame. So this is going to execute on every single frame. So every single frame that X-Plane draws, so again, like you've heard the term frame rate, like 60 frames per second. That means it's drawing 60 frames in an X-Plane. Now this may seem, and I'm going to actually call this function on every single frame, this assign buttons. And I'm actually going to give this a different name because this is changing purposes. I'm not really assigning buttons anymore. I'm doing context-specific buttons. So I'm going to call inside do every frame context-specific buttons. And that's what I'm going to change, and that's what I changed the name of this function to as well. I don't want to clear the button assignments on every single time it's called though. I'll just do it once by calling it down here. I could also put this at the top of the file, doesn't matter. It's going to get to it ultimately. And then I'm going to call do every frame. And what this does is this tells X-Plane, hey, take this function, context-specific buttons, this whole thing right here, and run it every single frame. And this allows me to keep checking whether I'm an external view or not. And if the is external is 1, that means it's true. I'm going to set the button assignment to the default view. Otherwise, if it's 0, it's going to send it to chase view. So let's save this and let me show you. Okay, so let's give this a shot. So everything should operate as before, but we have this new functionality with button 4. So you'll notice, look at this. Notice how it's alternating to that default view, which is this view inside the aircraft, to the chase view, as you see right here outside the plane. So this is great. So this button literally is changing what it does based on whether we are inside or outside the aircraft, and it just assigns it to do the opposite thing. And so this allows me to go back and forth, which again, this means that this button is allowed to change functions depending on what is happening inside the simulator. And this is just checking whether we're in an external view. We could tie pretty much to any variables we want inside the simulator that are accessible. And this is really powerful and honestly can get pretty overwhelming to think about, because things that are happening in the simulator can be used to change what functions are happening with the buttons dynamically. So this is great. This is something that we can definitely take advantage of and do some really cool things with. Now, you might be saying, okay, well, shoot, how do I discover these variables? I mean, sure, with controls and mapping to actions for the aircraft, I can use the controller menu, just like I showed you earlier, to do that. To go and find what commands correspond to which programmatic commands, as I'm doing right here. But how do I find things like, how do I figure out if I'm an external view or not? So there's actually another plugin that can be really helpful called the DataRef tool, which I'm showing right here. And if you go to DataRef, and I'll show a link in the description that you can click on and install that plugin in the exact same manner we installed FlyWithLua as well. Just copy and paste that folder into the plugins folder. And if I go to DataRef tool and search, you'll get this helpful little dialog that pretty much lists all of the commands. You can search through them. So, if I search for the word is external, I mean, there it is right here. That's the value we're looking for. But you might be also saying, okay, well, what if I don't even know how to search for that? So you can actually use some searching tools right here, including this, which I believe is to detect changing variables. And if I can help it by giving it a keyword, so like, if I can type in external and then I switch views, see and notice that value changed and it popped up and it's like, okay, that changed, is external. And so you can use this tool to help identify commands and find values that are changing. And if you can give it some keywords that you suspect are part of that command, that will help even more. If you also go on the X-Plane developer site, you can also use an online database containing all the commands, or you can just use the xplane.org forums under the FlyWithLua section to get assistance. So, hey, what command does this? But generally, I found this DataRef tool to be enormously helpful in discovering what the right DataRef is for a given variable. Okay, let's talk about another type of condition that we can control with. I am going to show you how to use a different type of environment variable, which is the type of aircraft you're using. It would make sense that for different types of aircraft, you might want different types of controller profiles. So for example, you can check if you're using a Cessna 172 like we're using right now, you don't really have a need for gears down and gears up because the gears are always down on a Cessna. So you may have a certain button do something for a Cessna that doesn't have gears up or gears down. You may repurpose it to something else, but for other aircraft, you want that button to be gears up, gears down. So make it the gears toggle. So let's talk briefly about how to do that. So I'm going to switch back over to my script that we were just working on. Pardon, it went from dark to light. I'm recording in the morning now, so my OS switched from dark mode to day mode. So I have what we just did earlier where we tracked the view as external variable. Now another thing I want to add here is I want to check for the plane type. So I'm going to copy some new code here. So here's where we were previously, and now I added this. And this is going to conditionally change how trim down and trim up is mapped depending if it's a Cessna 172 or a Boeing 737-800 aircraft. The way you check for the currently flying aircraft is you just use the plain ICAO variable, which is built in. and then you use the ICAO code for your specific aircraft. So you can go on Google, what is the ICAO code for, a Cessna 172 or a Boeing 737-800. And then you can use this to check what the plane type is, and if it is that given plane type, you give your assignments accordingly. So if it's a Cessna 172, I'm going to use the trim wheel as I'm spinning right here on my controller. And I'm going to map that to pitch trim down and pitch trim up, those two actions. And the POV up and down are going to maintain the hat switch functionality. So hat switch up, hat switch down. But if I'm using a 737-800, maybe I want to use the trim wheel for something else, and I want the POV up and down to do pitch trim up and pitch trim down. So you can see here that if it's a Boeing 737-800, then I am going to set my button assignment of POV up and POV down accordingly. And that's going to do pitch trim down, pitch trim up. So same thing before, clear all button. So I'm declaring this all as a function, just like we did previously. And I'm going to clear all the button assignments. And then on do every frame, I'm going to call that function context-specific buttons. So it's going to call this on every single frame on X-plane. So let's save this. So I'm going to hit Command S, or I can go to File, Save. And then I am going to switch back to X-plane. I'm going to go to Plugin, FlyWithLua, reload all script files. And you'll see here that my POV up and down maintains that POV, that hat up, hat down command. And my trim wheel, and let me zoom into the trim wheel right there, that is going to do trim down and trim up, respectively. So let's change our aircraft over to a Boeing 737-800 and see what happens. So I'm going to switch over to my Boeing 737-800, start new flight. Let's give it a moment to load up. And what we should see when we switch over to the new Boeing 737-800 aircraft is the trim wheel is going to be enabled by the POV. Now, I didn't map an alternative to moving my head around for the Boeing, so I'm just going to use my mouse. But you'll see here that when I do the POV up and POV down, it is indeed moving the trim wheel. And the trim wheel itself on the controller, or just the wheel, is not moving it at all. It's because for the Boeing 737-800, I specified it to control trim with the POV. So this is helpful. You can actually create different profiles for different aircraft within the same script. And so in this case, I just took care of the Cessna 172 and the Boeing 737-800. I could, back in my code, I could add an else clause, which would act as a catch-all for all aircraft. And I would just do my set button assignments for all the other types of aircraft. Or, sorry, aircraft outside of the 172 and the 738. Okay, so now let's talk about multi-press. And we're going to actually adapt this example and refine it a little bit further in a moment. But let me copy over this new piece of code right here and point out what's different here. So I'm going to clear all button assignments. So, I could have this at the top, or I could have it down here below the function. But I'm going to have this function called multi-press buttons. And I'm going to use a new operator, the button function. And what this is going to do is this is just going to straight up read the current value of that given button. So left bumper and right bumper. And I'm going to save that to two variables called left bumper pressed and right bumper pressed. These are going to hold a true or false value depending whether or not that button is currently being held. So my bumpers are these two buttons right here on the YOM, and so if I held this down, that would mean this would now be true, the left bumper pressed variable. If I held this one down, this would be the right bumper. Now, so let's talk about implementing this. So I'm tracking whether the left bumper or right bumper is pressed, and I can use these bumpers as modifiers, as multifunction buttons. So when I hold down a bumper and I do it in combination with another button, I can give that other button a new purpose, a new function. And so what I'm going to do here is I'm going to change the POV up, down, left, right, depending on whether the left bumper, the right bumper, or no bumpers are being held. So if the left bumper is pressed, then I am going to set the button assignments for left, right, up, down on the POV to just do the general left, right, up, down movements. And so this will allow me to strafe left and right and forward and backwards on the aircraft, or up and down. And then the right bumper pressed, if that's pressed, then I am going to do the POV to manage heading down and heading up for the left and right. So that'll move the heading bug left and right. And if I do POV up, it's going to manage the flaps up and down. Otherwise, if no bumpers are pressed at all, so that's going to be in the else. You'll notice this pattern I'm using, the if, else. So the else if allows me to move on to another condition to check if the previous condition ended up being false. And it allows me to evaluate the next one. I can add as many else ifs as I want. And then I can also put an else at the very end where nothing previous in the if, else, ifs qualified. So therefore, this is the last resort. This is what it resorts to when none of the conditions have ended up being true. In this case, it's no bumpers have been pressed, which I put a comment right here just to highlight that. And this is going to reassign the POV left, right, up, and down to just do the standard hat switch movements. Now, after the script, you'll notice here, I put my button assignments that are general, that aren't affected by the bumpers down here. And so these are going to execute once, and these should not be reassigned again because these are buttons that aren't affected by the bumpers. But anything that is affected by the bumpers should go into this script. Any multi-press buttons or multi-function buttons are going to go inside this function. And we're going to do the do every frame just like we did before, and it's going to call the multi-press buttons function. And this will be called on every frame of the simulator. So let's save this. Let me go back to my simulator. All right. So what we're going to do here is we're going to test out this mixture of modifiers. So you can see here my POV is still moving left, right, up, down, and that's great. If I hold the left bumper while I move the POV, watch what happens. I am now strafing left and right. And if I hit up on the POV, it is literally raising my camera up and down like this. So when I let go of the left bumper, it goes back to the standard POV head movements. So this gives my camera a lot more freedom to move around easily, and that is thanks to using this modifier, this left bumper, that changes what the POV switch does. Now to be clear, you can do this with any other button. So like the 6-pack and the D-pad, the trim wheel even. I can have that left bumper change the behavior of any of these other buttons. I just have to map each of them in the Lua script. Now the right bumper, let me go ahead and let's slow ourselves a little bit here just to kind of see what's going on. Okay, so to pay attention to what the right bumper does, you'll see that as I hold down the right bumper, that's what causes the flaps to move up and down if I hit the up and down movements on the POV. So that's pretty cool. So I can actually start using this to control aircraft systems. Another mapping I did under the right bumper with the POV is it will change the heading. So if you look, let me actually move over to the right a little bit so we can see this a bit more clearly. So you'll see, pulling down the right bumper, if I move the POV left and right, it is literally changing the heading on that autopilot control. And you can see it happening on the primary display as well. You can see that purple line moving. So this demonstrates how you can change button behaviors based on modifiers on other buttons. So the left and right bumpers, they don't do anything on their own. And nothing, when you press them, nothing really changes action-wise. But it does change what other buttons do. It's just like a control or shift key on a keyboard. When you hold down a control or shift key, that changes, lowercase letters to uppercase letters, or lets you access different punctuation marks. It changes the mode of other buttons, and that's exactly what we did here. Now we could make the 6-pack act as modifiers. We could arbitrarily change any buttons to become modifiers, but typically you're going to do something where 1 or 2 or maybe 6 buttons right here will act as modifiers and give functionality and give more functionalities to other buttons. Now, one thing that might be useful is to press both bumpers for, say, brakes, to actually apply the brakes and toggle the brakes on your aircraft. So that is actually possible to do. So what I want to change here is I am going to copy and paste a new script right here that has a modification to what we had previously. So we saw the left bumper pressed, the right bumper pressed functionality, and the else condition. But what I'm going to do as well is I am going to add a behavior when the left bumper is pressed. We're going to set the right bumper to call brakes toggle max as specified in this DataRef command right here. So, and again, the way if else works is it's going to run this from top to bottom, and the first one it finds to be true is the one it's going to go with and stop there. Unless it finds nothing to be true, then it's going to just resort to this else branch. So let me walk through this. So if the left bumper is pressed, then I'm going to assign my POV to general left, right, up, down, like we showed earlier. That includes the strafing movements as well as moving your head literally up and down. Moving the camera up and down, not your head. But I'm also going to set the right bumper to call brakes toggle max. Otherwise, if the right bumper's pressed, which by the way, if the left bumper's pressed, it's not going to get to this point. It's just going to assign the right bumper immediately here and execute that action. But if the left bumper is not pressed, it's going to move on to the right bumper pressed action, and it's going to proceed like we did earlier. It's going to assign POV left, right, up, and down to heading down, heading up, flaps up, and flaps down, respectively. But if neither the left bumper or the right bumper are pressed, this is very important. I need to set the right bumper to not do anything again and not assign it to any action. So I'm going to assign it to I'm going to assign the right bumper to have the action sim/none/none. What that basically is in X-Plane in DataRef speak is that just says don't do anything. Just give it no action at all. And this will restore the right bumper to not performing any action, although it will still be read to see if it's pressed or not to act as a multifunction button. But it's not going to map to any X-Plane actions. That will happen within the set button assignments accordingly. So let's save the script. Let's go ahead and reload it, and we will demonstrate this at work. So everything. So we got the left, right, up, down. We still have the left bumper, move left, right, and then move up and move down. But when I press, and of course I have the right bumper will do its own actions, like here it's moving the flaps up and down. I can use the left and right now with the right bumper to move the heading bug. But what I want to show is when I press both of these bumpers, it's going to disengage the brakes. Did you see that? So you'll see that it is very reliably turning the brake, the parking brake on and off, and it's switching it back and forth. Now it doesn't matter if I do right brake, or sorry, do the right bumper then the left bumper, it'll still work. Because that's going to cause the left bumper to shift into its own mode, and that it'll see the right bumper's pressed. If I hold the right bumper alone, it's only going to enable the right bumper modifier. And if I do the left then the right, that'll still work as well. So just because the way we structure that if, else, if, and the fact that it executes top to bottom, and the first one it finds to be true is the one it goes with, we can leverage that to enable both these buttons together being pressed, essentially turns it into an action, and no longer just individual modifiers. The left button technically is the modifier, but the right button becomes an action only while the left bumper is pressed, because the moment we let go, it's going to go in that else branch where it assigns the right bumper back to a none action. All right, so moving on, let's just learn a few more patterns here. So of course I can leverage multi-press with different aircraft. And let me switch back over to my script. And what I'm going to do right here is I'm going to remove a lot of those other commands and just focus on this right here, where I'm going to check if the plane's a Cessna 172 or if it's a Boeing 737-800. And if it's a Cessna 172, I am going to set the trim wheel to be assigned to the wheel down and wheel up motions on the controller, as I'm doing right now. And I'm going to set the POV up and POV down on the controller to hat switch up and hat switch down. Now, if the Boeing is a 737-800, however, I'm going to check if the right bumper is pressed. And if that right bumper is pressed, I'm going to map that POV to do trim up and trim down. It's not going to use the trim wheel here. Instead, the way the Boeing 737-800 is mapped to trim is it's going to be the right bumper and the POV move up and down. And the POV up and POV down are going to be the standard hat switch up, hat switch down. Now, I could probably take these two button assignments, since they're the same right here, and just move it outside down here on the script. But it's not going to cause any harm. You might say, well, if it's going to keep reassigning the same thing over and over again, is that going to create inefficiency? Not necessarily. Lua is pretty efficient, and FlyWithLua has been implemented pretty efficiently, so you should not have that problem. And even though this is running this on every single frame, as long as you're not doing anything too crazy that causes complex computations, it's going to be lightning quick. It shouldn't really disrupt. It really should not disrupt the frame rate and the performance of X-Plane, as long as you're not getting too nuts in what you're doing in every single frame. In this case, we're just modifying controls very quickly, which should not take a lot of time. So let's save the script. Let's go back over to our go to plugins, FlyWithLua, reload all script files, and you'll see here that the trim wheel works as expected by using the wheel on my controller, and I got the left, right, up, down on the POV. If I hold down the right bumper, note that it's not changing the behavior of the POV. The POV is ignoring what the right bumper's doing. But if I switch over to a Boeing 737-800, watch this. What's going to happen here is that the right bumper being held and moving the POV up and down will do something. It should control the trim. And the trim wheel is not going to have that action. So you'll see here that if I hit it up and down, it is using the trim based on the POV input on the bumper up and down. And if I use the trim wheel in the Boeing 737-800, or sorry, the wheel on the Yaman Arrow, it's not doing anything. That's because I mapped this specifically to do trim using the right bumper and the up or down movement on the POV. And of course, all the other movements I've mapped, including the POV, are working just fine. And when I hit the right bumper and move the hat switch up and down, it changes the trim. So this just shows you can actually mix different aircraft with different multi-function button configurations. So there's a lot of power there. There's a lot of things that you can achieve there. All right, so almost done here. Let me just show one more example just to give you some inspiration. And let me switch back over to my code. I'm going to paste this final stub of code right here. And this is just going to show, rather than use the bumpers, I'm going to use what we call the 6-pack to act as modifiers. And this gives me 6 different modifiers or multifunction buttons that I can leverage and use with, for example, the D-pad, or use with the trim, or even use with the bumpers and the POV. So I'm going to just follow that same pattern, clear all button assignments, assign all of my controls to those variables so that I keep track of which numbers they are. And I'm going to declare my multi-press buttons function. But notice here what I'm doing now is instead of keeping track of the bumpers being pressed, I'm just tracking button 5 and button 6 being pressed. So those are those 2 buttons right here, the 6-pack 5 and 6-pack 6. Sorry, 6-pack 5, 6-pack 6, not button 5, button 6. Relative to the 6-pack, 6-pack button number 5, 6-pack button number 6. So if the 6-pack 5 is pressed, I am going to assign the D-pad to perform an autopilot change of heading down and heading up, respectively. And that's what I've configured right here by calling those DataRefs. If button 6 is called, or 6-pack button 6 is called, that's going to change the vertical speed of my autopilot, as shown here. Otherwise, it's going to allow the D-pad to just move in and move out, just to zoom in and zoom out, and that's it. So you can use the 6-pack as modifiers too. I'm just demonstrating just 2 of them to give you the idea. So let's save this. And then after that, I am going to just set the POV. So outside of that function, and this is only run once, the POV left, right, up, and down are going to just map the hat switch left, right, and up and down. And actually, this is going to be do every frame, not do every draw. You can use the do every draw function if you want, but just based on what I was researching, you want to probably use do every frame when you are using environmental variables. So like if I were to ever try to extract out whether the view is external or not, the do every frame doesn't get along with that. Or sorry, the do every draw does not get along with that, but the do every frame does. So that was a little mistake I left there, or slight mistake. So I'm just calling do every frame to call the multi-press functions, or multi-press buttons. Sorry, my coffee is totally wearing off right now. Okay, so let's reload. So go to FlyWithLua, reload all scripts. And now what we should see is that if I don't hold the button 5 or button 6 6-pack, D-pad in and D-pad up will zoom in, D-pad down will zoom out. So that's the default, that's what it goes to in the else branch. But if I do hold down button 5 or 6-pack button 5, you'll see that it is indeed changing the heading. So actually, you know what? Let me zoom in right there and show you. So let's zoom in right there. And let me hold down 6-pack button 5. So you'll see that it is now changing the heading, moving it up. Now it's moving it down, based on whether I'm hitting up or down on the D-pad. If I hold down button 6, that is going to change the vertical speed. So you'll see that vertical speed on the far right is now changing. So I'm decreasing the vertical speed. Now I'm increasing the vertical speed. So there you go. So that's just another example of how you might set up multifunction buttons. You could actually set each of these 6-packs to be a different multifunction button, a different modifier, and this gives you essentially 6 copies of the D-pad and the POV and the trim wheel and the bumpers, and you basically get 6 times what those things can do based on holding each one of these down to perform a different function. And you could also make this analogous to a 6-pack like on a Cessna 172, where each of those instruments are targeting a certain function in flight, and you can use that as a mapping and using that as a memory tool as well. So that is pretty much it when it comes to multifunction buttons. This should give you a lot to play with. I mean, and you can use this, like I said, you can use this situationally based on what the flight sim's doing as well. So, like I said, you can check what aircraft you're using and say, oh, is this the type of aircraft that has gears up, gears down toggling? If so, map this. Otherwise, if it's a Cessna 172 where there is no gears up functionality, because the gears are always fixed, then you can actually use the button for a different purpose. So very powerful, very useful stuff. Just as a quick bonus, I'm going to throw in one last thing, and that is just going to be talking about axes. Okay, one last thing I want to talk about here. I want to walk through one final script that works with axes. All right, so when I call this assign axes function, the first thing it's going to do is going to clear all axis assignments. I'm going to assign, just similar to what I did with buttons, I'm going to keep track of which axis index corresponds to what's currently mapped on my controller. The way you can get these current assignments of what axis index they are from, for example, here there's 7 axes, so it's indices 0 through 6. There is in the FlyWithLua folder. Let me go ahead and open that back up. So in the FlyWithLua folder, if I go into let's see, plugins, FlyWithLua. If I go into the scripts disabled folder, which is where all of the example scripts are stored, there is one helpful script called, let's see, where is it? I know it's here somewhere. Yeah, get axis assignments, this one. And what this will do is this will take your current controller and it will output to the log when you call the macro what the current assignments are. So I'm going to copy that and put it into my active scripts folder. And I am going to switch over to XPlate again. And I am going to reload all my scripts. And remember, I said this is a macro, so this is not running constantly like a lot of the do every frame functions we've been messing with. So we're going to call right axis assignments to log. So I'm going to run that, and then I'm going to go back to my Xplane directory, open up Log.txt, and I'm going to widen up this window. I'm going to zoom in quite a bit. Okay, so I'm going to grab the scroll bar, and you'll see here that it literally outputs not just the indices of what each index is mapped to, each axis and what function it's mapped to, but it also gives us Lua commands that we can literally copy and paste to recreate these axis assignments. Now, I'm not going to quite do that. I'm just going to take note of which axis number corresponds to, roll, pitch, mixture, throttle, yaw, props, flaps, based on what the yaw arrow is currently assigned to. So I'm going to save each of those indices to a variable. So I observed that the thumbstick, its x-axis is mapped to 0, its y-axis is mapped to 1. I'm going to keep track of the left and right pole, which are 2 and 3 respectively. And rudder, which is this axis right here, this seesaw, that is going to be assigned axis 4. And we got slider left and slider right. Those are those are axes 5 and 6 respectively. And I will set each of those axes accordingly based on those indices. And I can also conditionally set axes. So like for example, if I'm using a Cessna 172, I want to actually map the throttle to be this left pole. But if it's any other aircraft, I want to map it to this slider at the top. So, so if I go back to my flight sim, oh, and also one last thing before I go to the demonstration, you can also set null zones on your joystick, and there's several other configurations you can do to tweak your axes as well. So like here I'm setting the null zone for pitch and roll to 0.10. And if you read the FlyWithLua manual, which I'll show where it is shortly, it will give you a lot more details. And then I'm going to add this as a macro called assign YAM and axes, and it's going to call the assign axes function that we declared up here. So switching back over to X-Plane, here it is. I can go to plugins, FlyWithLua, reload all scripts, and I can call assign YAM and axes. And now, if I'm in a Cessna, you'll notice that this left vernier pole is now mapped to throttle. And if I use the left slider, that doesn't really have a function right here. That's I believe it's tied to RPM, which does not have any effect on the Cessna, or sorry, props. And if I were to switch over to a Boeing 737 or any other aircraft, it would go to that else branch. It would map this to throttle. But inside a Cessna, this becomes throttle. So definitely use the scripting capabilities to help streamline your configuration for each specific type of aircraft. Now, just remember, when you switch to a different aircraft, make sure you run that macro again to reassign the YAM and axes. I mean, you could probably you could probably do something a bit more dynamic like we saw earlier, to where it'll automatically update at the beginning of a flight or on every frame, which probably is going to be overkill to reassign those axes over and over again. But there are ways. There are lots and lots of ways. All right, so that is all I have for this. If you want to learn more, I do recommend going into the documentation. So if you go inside the X-Plane folder and you go into, oh, where is it? Go to resources. Oh wait, sorry, not X-Plane 12. Duh. What am I doing? So you're going to go inside. You're going to go inside the plugin folder. My bad. So you're going to go into plugins, FlyWithLua, and inside the FlyWithLua folder, you'll find the documentation. And inside that documentation folder, you'll find the FlyWithLua manual in English, for example, and you'll see it in EPUB and PDF format. So definitely check this out. There's a lot of really helpful information here that you will probably benefit from. So, for example, it explains the difference between on every draw, do every draw and do every frame, and explains the DataRefs in more detail. So there's a lot, and you can do keystrokes and keyboard shortcuts. There's a lot of different things you can do with FlyWithLua, and it can really unhinge your imagination on the things you can do. So definitely take a look at this. Definitely get plugged into the FlyWithLua community, and I hope you all have fun with this. If you liked this video, if you found this really helpful, please do check out our new handheld controller, the YAM Aero. It is a fully functional handheld flight simulation solution on the go. It even has rudder control through these connected axes, or these mechanically linked triggers. And you have 7 axes, and as you saw, there is an enormous amount of things you can achieve with this, controlling view management, autopilots, and hand flying. And you could even use it to supplement your larger flight sim rig, and use this to do things like control drone views, for example. All right, but that's all I have, folks, and I hope you got a lot out of this. If there's other topics you want to see that we can help with, just let us know, and we will try our very best to get to it. I will see you next time.